Hello, beautiful souls, and welcome to the Woo Curious podcast, your map to the mystical, your key to the sacred, and your guide back home to yourself. I'm Eileen, a writer, a spiritual coach, energy healer, and slow living witch. This podcast is your invitation to explore a world where the mundane and the sacred intertwine. It's a haven for those ready to take the first steps into the realms of magic and mystery, providing a safe space for you to embark on your own enchanted journey towards healing and self-discovery. Here, I'll unveil the whispers of the mystical, the rituals often hidden in plain sight, and I'll engage in sacred conversation intended to stir your soul and lead you back into your power. I'm all about demystifying woo and witchcraft. So, whether you're a seasoned seeker or simply woo curious, I'm so delighted you've decided to join me on this journey. Let's make magic. Hello, Woo Crew, and welcome back to another episode of the Woo Curious podcast. I am your host, Eileen, and I am here today with a solo episode. I am just on the other side of 2 weeks off, 2 weeks of vacation, of music festival and traveling the East Coast and a wedding out in beautiful Canmore. And I have some things that I wanted to share with you today about what I was noticing during my time away and since coming back, as well as some of what we spoke about yesterday for me, as I speak, in our Wise Wild Woman mentorship call. We have 4 calls a month inside the mentorship. 2 of them are what I call learning and connection calls, where I bring a topic and a little bit of teaching, and then there's a lot of space to connect and discuss with each other, sharing what comes up for each of us with these topics and learning from each other as we go. The other 2 calls in the month are, one is a writing circle, co-hosted and led by Sheena, my dear co-conspirator in that part of the mentorship program. You'll have heard her voice last week on the podcast because I was part of her One Step Ahead series, which is a YouTube podcast series. Highly recommend checking it out, full of some beautiful conversations and great resources. And then the other call each month is a new moon rest circle. And I have it on good authority from those inside that it is worth the price of admission. That's a direct quote from one of the members inside. And it is definitely the call that I look forward to the most because I get to drop into intuition, into that channeled guidance and using the gift I was given of being able to connect with my guides and use my voice to channel that connection and take us on some really deep transformative journeys. And so I wanted to share a little bit with you today about what we were chatting about yesterday in that call because it came out of some things that I was noticing on my trip, on my vacation. And the topic of yesterday's call was everyday animism. And this idea of animism is one that you are likely familiar with. The direct definition, I looked it up, and I'm going to read to you a couple of the definitions. And I'm going to talk about a little bit why they feel problematic to me. So one of the definitions, or the first one that pops up if you Google animism, is the attribution of a soul to plants, inanimate objects, and natural phenomena. And while that is in essence true of what animism is, the idea of attributing a soul to an inanimate object immediately makes it not inanimate, right? And so there's difficulties with the language. And it's like this, the way that it's described or defined, the attribution of, makes it feel like it's humans that are doing the ensouling of these beings, plants, creatures, static objects. I'm going to call them that instead of inanimate. And it takes away the agency of those beings, of those creatures, of those objects. And so that is one of the problems, a big problem that I have with that definition. The other definition that pops up immediately is the belief in a supernatural power that organizes and animates the material universe. And that might be more true for a lot of folks when they're thinking about animism and talking about it. And for me, again, I have a problem with the language. Supernatural. That is outside of nature, outside of the natural way of being of things. And again, it takes agency away from the beings themselves, and the power that organizes and animates. And so when we're thinking about animism, and the word itself was really invented by anthropologists to describe a way of being and relating and understanding the world that is held by most, if not all, indigenous cultures. In current contemporaneous indigenous cultures and most human cultures, if we go back a little ways or a long ways, depending on where we're looking at. And so it's interesting to me to think about the ways in which language really kind of pigeonholes us into a specific way of thinking about what animism means and what it is. And I talked inside the Wise Wild Woman mentorship about how it's not a belief system. It's a way of, more than understanding even, it's a way of experiencing the world, and the world as having agency and sovereignty and its own ensoulment, right? It's not being gifted or attributed soul. It has each being, body of water, weather event, static object, creature, rock, plant. It is animate. They are animate. And again, that actually speaking there, that the idea, it is animate, that de-animates things. That word, it. Robin Wall Kimmerer in Braiding Sweetgrass, which if you have not read, I highly recommend. It's one of my favorite books. I picked it up to prepare for yesterday's session and found myself crying after reading 2 paragraphs. It always happens. She speaks about, or gives a really good example of the way in which the English language, and many languages, but the English language is the one she's speaking to, de-animates the world, and how wrong it would feel for us to de-animate, as it were, human beings. And so she gives the example, many indigenous languages don't have a word for it. If you're referring to a stone or a plant or a bay or an ocean, there's no it. There's no way to refer to it that way, to those things that way. And in those cultures, we can extrapolate that it feels really weird and wrong to think about referring to animate beings as it. And so if you think about, she gives the example in the book of how, if you walked into the kitchen and your grandmother was there baking cookies, you would never say, oh, it's baking cookies in the kitchen. It has gray hair. You would say she, or you would say her name. You would never refer to a person as an it. Or we hope you never would. I know what my listeners here would never refer to another person as an it. And because it's dehumanizing, but it's depersonalizing in so many ways. And so there is this sense of, when we talk about animacy and animism and living in an animate world and moving through the world, experiencing it as animate, we have this massive shift in how we relate with the world and the magic that it can offer up, and the ways in which it helps us to not feel lonely. And so this is all weaving back to the story that I wanted to tell about being away, being on the go. I had a really lovely time while we were away. We went to Nova Scotia. That was the primary bulk of our vacation, the time away. And the plan and what we did was a road trip. And we had plans to go to different beaches and visit little towns. We had plans to go on some beautiful walks through nature. We did lots of that, but one of the things that kind of threw a wrench in our plans was that it's been a drought out there all summer. They have not had anywhere near the rain that they need. And so there's a huge fire risk. And a few days before we arrived, the woods were closed. And it's just I found it a very quaint way of speaking of it. The language out in the East Coast is a little different than the way we use language here, and I love it. But they say they closed the woods. Basically, any wooded area, anywhere there were trees and naturey bits that wasn't a beach was closed. All the paths, all the walking paths, all the trails, all the lookout points, it was all closed in order to try to prevent or mitigate the fire risk. And I'm fully supportive of this. And it meant that we ended up in the car a little more than we might have done. We did a little more driving. It was really hot too, and we didn't have an umbrella for the beach, so we didn't sit on the beaches the way we might have had the weather been a little bit less scorchingly hot. It was up around that 30-degree mark most days. And we drove a lot, and we saw many beautiful things, but I never really felt like we paused or stopped anywhere long enough for me to really sink in. And that's partly my own doing in a big way. It's my own doing, is that on the go, traveling, experiencing new things, it's really easy to get swept up in the events of it all and forget to take that time to pause and to be still and to carve out space to be alone. Especially, when you're we were staying in a hostel in Halifax, we were staying in Airbnbs where sometimes it's easy to find a little personal space, but often, you're in your room with your partner, in my case, and that space to have some solitude and to sink into some of my practices, pulling a card, doing some journaling, just sitting and being, I didn't remember to make it a priority beforehand. And so we got to the end of our trip, and I realized that I hadn't really connected with the land, with the experience. I had experienced things, but I hadn't embodied the experience. And it was the last day we were there, and we were walking through a park in Halifax, a memorial park, memorializing the Halifax explosion. And there's beautiful flowers. There's echinacea and yarrow and a whole bunch of other flowers that I don't recognize, or that I recognize but I don't know. And walking along, and then suddenly I saw a monarch butterfly. And I haven't seen a monarch in the wild since I can't remember when. I was quite young. I feel like I was a child or a teenager still. I've seen them in zoos and, that kind of situation. But a monarch in the wild absolutely stopped me in my tracks. I was just sitting on this beautiful purple flower, and then it got up and was fluttering around, and it was circling around my head and being buffeted by the wind, and I was absolutely captivated in this moment of suddenly being pulled into the present, into my body, into connection with that life being, that life that was fluttering around, into this reminder of the fragility and the stunning beauty of life, and the fact that the world is out there, always present, just waiting for us to remember to notice. And it was a really profound moment of reconnection when suddenly all the other voices in my head got really quiet and the world got loud. It got loud in its life force vivacity. It got loud in its simplicity and its beingness. It reminded me so powerfully that we are never alone. We never are. And pausing to connect, remembering to allow ourselves to be captivated, to stand in awe and wonder, to greet the beings all around us, not just the plants and the animals and the rocks, but the objects that we consider inanimate. To have relationships with the more than human world creates a depth of meaning and peace, and it banishes loneliness and overwhelm and stress in a way that nothing else I've found does or can. So as we spoke about this experience of mine, and we spoke about animacy and the ensoulment of the world, we also spoke about the idea of how we communicate with this more than human world. And the desire, the deep desire, and almost arrogance, I think that's my word, of this sense that we can perhaps learn the languages of other beings and maybe communicate with them in their language. And while it's a very neat idea, and so this idea or thought came about from a podcast I was listening to, the Emergence podcast, and they were talking about communicating with whales and deciphering, I'm going to call it whalish. And the question was posed, like, what are the ethics of deciphering whalish? Do the whales want us to be speaking to them in their language? And what happens if we decipher and we figure out how to communicate in this language and we don't like what they're telling us? What do we do then? So like lots of little interesting kind of places to let your mind go, to follow down these tracks. And remembering, and I think this is for me something I have to be reminded of over and over, that I don't need to understand the language per se. I don't need to understand specifically the communication that's happening. I can feel that it is happening. An example of this is coming home from this vacation. Something I did before I left was to go and bid farewell to my tree out back. If you've been here with me for a while, you'll likely have heard me speak about my Mayday tree, otherwise known as a hagberry tree, otherwise, and those are the only two I can remember right now. And how much I love this tree and how I talk to it all the time. It's my fairy tree. It is a type of tree beloved by the Fae, and I leave offerings at this tree. And this specific tree, there's another one on the other side of my house, just off my property line, that really didn't flower the same way this year. And I had a theory perhaps that my tree that I talk to all the time is responding in kind. Anyways, I had gone and I'd said goodbye to this tree and let it know that I'd be back in a couple of weeks, that my dear friend would be taking care of the house and my kitty and the plants. And when I came home, one of the first things I did early the next morning, we got in late. So early the next morning, I went outside and I put my hands on my tree and I said, hello, I'm back. And the sense of welcome and of pleasure was so strong. It actually surprised me because there's still definitely big parts of my brain that are like, are you making shit up, Eileen? Have you lost your marbles? And the real experience of having a tree welcome me home in a way that felt so strong and embodied was magical. It was magical. That's all I can say. So what I'd love for you from this conversation to take forward into your day, into your week, into your life is a reminder and a practice of pausing and connecting and noticing. And it can be as simple as saying hello to the rising sun, to your favorite plant, to the candle you love on your desk. What does it feel like in your body to move through a world that is ensouled, that is animate? One of the women inside of the Wise Wild Woman mentorship spoke about the way she perceives this and as energy, as simply energy, especially when you start to think about wrapping your brain around the idea that perhaps your pen is animate. How is this, plastic petroleum product created by humans animate? And I loved the idea of remembering that it is energy, and energy is always in motion. And so even if that's as far as your brain can go, is like, okay, there are atoms in this pen and they are moving. And that is maybe not a soul, but it is animation in some ways. Then that's a great start. And I'd be curious to have you simply play with this idea, play with the noticing, play with the pausing, play with the listening, and allowing yourself to be open to hear, even if you don't understand the language. Okay, I'm going to wrap this up here. If you're listening to this the week that it comes out and you are on the pre-order list for my book, you're getting the link to read it today ahead of the official launch date on Thursday, the 28th. Awaken to the Magic Within. Rediscover what your bones remember. It's an ebook. It's short. It's just a little taste, a little beginning, if you will. And I decided to keep it free because I want it to be accessible. I want what I've poured into this, the wisdom that lives within, the tools to be available to everyone and anyone. I would be so delighted to have you read it and to share with me how it lands for you, and to share it with your friends, your family, your sisters, your mothers, women everywhere. I also am going to be starting to talk about Root, which is my next 5-day free offering, much like Shine back in the summer and Bloom back in the spring. Root is a guided journey to step into your worth this time. So stay tuned for that. I think there'll be a link below. Go check. And please feel free to join me for that as well. Definitely get yourself on the pre-order list for the book. If you haven't already, you'll get a sweet little sacred rest ritual as an additional bonus to that. And you'll get access on Thursday if you weren't on the pre-order list before today. All right. That's all for now, Woo Crew. As always, if you like this episode, if you like this podcast, please take a moment to leave a 5-star rating, to review it, to share it. If you're listening or watching on YouTube, like, subscribe, comment, all of those good things. It truly means the world every time anyone takes the time out of their day to do these things for me. I appreciate each and every one of you so much. I hope you have a wonderful week, and I'll be back here this time next week. Bye for now.